There is an old plantation road just north and west of Charleston that snakes along the Ashley River, and having traversed the distance with frequency, I can justly claim it as the loveliest in the South, perhaps the continent. The heavily trodden byway is worn with dust, dirt, and age, but lined indiscriminately by towering ancient oaks, their limbs forming an arc overhead nearly touching those on the other side. And in that gap, a brilliant patchwork of green and browns, deep reds and orange forms each fall. The sun curtly pokes through in intervals and paints small patterns of light below. And yet, as each day wanes into night, and the moon rises to dispatch that brilliant star, the deep wood and the winding road through it take on a new appearance, one that tests the sinew and bonds within. And the untrustworthy eye peering out from behind a lantern. Howling winds shake the trees and call menacingly to each passer-by who could be forgiven for referencing the scream of a banshee. And little is known of what lurks at the wood's edge, just beyond the beams of light crawling at the forest floor. The moment at which myth bleeds into fact blurs in the mind of a traveler at night in such a place. Eyes watching from all angles, ears pricked at the slightest snap of a twig. Only the most desperate for work would accept a rider traveling so late, and even fewer in colder seasons. And it was on such an evening that I found myself impatiently waiting on a carriage, one that had been prearranged to arrive by the roadside at the entrance to the wood just before dark, or around 7 p.m. Traveling by foot was forbidden, as the visibility was nearly non-existent save for the occasional bits of moonlight breaking through the canopy overhead. Oil lamps were required on all carriages, or gigs, as the two-wheeled varieties were known, within an hour of dusk, and could only be extinguished at the arrival of dawn. And so the familiar glow of amber light could be seen for quite a distance, bobbing rhythmically down the lane, and at all hours of the night. With the fog recently settling in, I had anticipated a delay of some kind, but with my timepiece now reflecting 7:30 p.m., contemplated setting out on foot, despite the regulations. Just then, the clod of hoofs on the road met my ears, and a devilishly black carriage appeared through the thick air some 100 feet or so in the direction of Charleston. The glowing beam dispersed only moderately through the haze, but in the reflection of light I could make out the driver as he hustled a great white steed on towards me. Finally, I thought. The roar of jangly wooden parts tossing about in unison would have woken anyone catching sleep at this hour, and I tried to imagine the sort of lunatic who might acclimate to such situations for precious little compensation. Injuries sustained while traveling in a carriage were quite common, and those who performed the task daily for a living would likely find themselves bedridden later in life. These and other thoughts passed in moments, and I held my hat aloft briefly as the driver brought his majestic beast to a stop, its eyes shielded on the sides with dark blinders. "Have you need for a ride, sir?" Patches of dirt and soot seemed to cover his clothes in nearly every spot, and his hands gave an appearance of age much grander than his eyes led me to believe, their glossy mirrors peering out from under a tilted cap. "Yes, of course, I requested that some time ago, and will need to make haste if I'm to attend the funeral." I climbed into the cart, noting again its bleakness and lack of any detail, and tightened the coat around my shoulders. The wind had picked up a bit, and an early autumn chill bit my lips like the sting of a bee. My companion gave every appearance of a simple farmer who happened on a carriage and plied the profession between harvests. The driving coat and rather sharp white shirt beneath were tarnished with dirt and dust, and in his face he wore many years of toiling in the fields. "Dreadfully sorry to learn of the passing, sir," he lamented rather remorsefully, and then gave the reins a thrust, and we set off. "It's Mr. Moravian. Simon Moravian." I might have sounded more coarse than needed, I thought. "At your service, Mr. Moravian." The muscles on our horse flexed in stride, and we entered the forest at a brisk pace, the black air enveloping the carriage on all sides, with only the oil lamp remaining visible. For the next 10 minutes or so we trundled along, kicking up inordinate clouds of dust and dirt, such that the driver leaned over on more than one occasion to wipe the glass panes on the lamp. The breeze rustled overhead, and in between the dangly limbs of the oaks, a continuous bundle of crisp autumn leaves crashed to the forest floor. A light rain had preceded the fog earlier, and the glistening water droplets adorned each leaf, illuminated momentarily in the moonlight snaking through the canopy. My companion gave this no mind, despite my appreciation of its beauty, and pressed hard through the fog. "Nearly there, sir. Maybe 5 minutes now." His gravelly voice bit harshly through the sound of the wheels tumbling down the road. Nonetheless, I asked him to repeat that last statement. Having done so, a puzzling thought lingered in my mind for a few seconds as I stared off into the distance. How did he know my destination? There were several plantations, as well as other stops along this stretch of road, and I recalled that he had asked me if I needed a ride, giving no indication of expecting I would be waiting on his carriage specifically. I turned partially to face him and raised my voice, that I be heard amongst the ruckus. "I don't believe I caught your name, driver." He glanced in my direction and nodded slowly, as if in confirmation. "What may I call you?" Once more he simply nodded and gave the reins a fresh crack. The chill had arrived suddenly and with quite a bitter front, so I pulled my coat tight around the shoulders and then wiped the oil lamp free of dirt and grime myself, if only to feel its momentary heat. Having no alternative, and with only moments to spare until the services began at 7:45 p.m., I resolved to keep as quiet and warm as I could. Just ahead, I barely made out the shape of the old Jameson cabin, which was long since forgotten and rotted woefully with each passing year. On my last journey through these woods, a few hogs were wandering about inside, having broken the front door down by force, and furnished quite a home for themselves. But now the darkness had claimed it too, as it does all things. People, places, ideas, all succumb in time. Moments later, the old grayish-white fence forming the border between Drayton Hall's boundary and that of the road gradually came into view, lit softly by the glow of the oil lamp facing that side. As if guided by mere telepathy, the driver brought our carriage to a slow trot, deftly making the sharp turn onto another dirt path that led straight to the main house. The beautiful 3-story brick mansion, which was illuminated by lamplight that reflected in a great pond a few 100 feet in its front, materialized through the dense fog and grew larger by the second as we approached. Not a soul was in view, and I reasoned this to be on account of the funeral, which would have taken place in the family cemetery that overlooked the Ashley River from atop a small rise. the driver brought our carriage to a complete stop right in the apex of the path that curved gently in front of the mansion. I leaned over to give the horse a sturdy pat on its backside, then hopped off and for a moment paused to reflect at the grandeur before me. The house was majestic, with tall white columns and a grand portico that seemed both inviting and also intimidating in its own way. My family had occupied this land for generations, but I was not interested in plantation life and had departed years ago for Charleston, eventually settling further south near the banks of the Ashley, where I engaged with a fellow lawyer and established a firm we were quite proud of. Other than occasional dinners or unfortunate circumstances such as this one, I had rarely visited our ancestral grounds, and thus each time its beauty captured my imagination. A sharp neigh broke the dream state suddenly, and I spun around, apologizing and fishing for some coin in my pocket. "No need, Mr. Moravian." He smiled and nodded, tipping his cap ever so slightly. "Pardon? I have payment for you, driver." I extended a hand with more than enough coin to cover the trip. I nodded in an effort of persuasion. His hand waved mine away, and with little effort he angled the horse back down the path we had just traversed. Once more his gravelly voice broke the silence. "It's not for me, sir." I stood perplexed, and then watched as the carriage disappeared down the path and into the fog. After attempting to process these events for a few moments, I ascended the stairs to the great house, grabbed one of the lanterns at the top, and then gave the door a hearty knock. I waited for what seemed minutes. Nothing. Not a sound, not a light. Nothing. I peered in through a window and held the light up to my face, but I couldn't discern anything aside from dusty old furniture. Odd that even the caretakers of the house seemed absent. I considered calling out, but then thought better of it. They must all be at the cemetery, I concluded. Descending the stairs, I started off for the great lawn behind the house, which ended at another dirt pathway, this time for foot traffic, which itself led to the cemetery. As the fog lifted a bit, I could finally see a number of warm lanterns glowing off in the distance. A quick check at my timepiece revealed 7:47 p.m., and I was officially late to the funeral. I hastened a bit and scampered across the field, narrowly avoiding the pools of mud which permeated the damp surroundings. An eerie feeling descended from the air as I neared the cemetery, and the dozens of lanterns shining through the haze. Numerous dark figures wandered about at first, and then appeared to congregate around a grave. I couldn't make out any of their faces in the distance, and even with the oil lamp outstretched, I couldn't seem to properly illuminate much of anything. But there was much to hear, and above it all, the prophetic words of a priest split the night air ominously. The cadence almost seemed to reveal itself in the form of a song, which brought each hair on my neck upright at once. Elsewhere, the sound of the river rushing by echoed off the bluff, and the tall oaks surrounding the cemetery swayed ever so slightly in the breeze. But I could only discern that particular movement by the light of the moon. As I brought my eyes back to the scene in front of me, the lantern extinguished. At once, the rhythmic chanting ceased, and every dark and dreary face turned in my direction. A deep chill fell over me, and washed my bones dry of life, it seemed. And yet, the breeze suddenly calmed. I took a few steps forward, peering into the oval caverns on each face, empty and devoid of all life. I could feel their energy as I passed, electric and tingly like the cusp of a rainstorm. The only light now visible was a near-blinding reflection of the silver emanating from a Victorian cross adorning the priest's neck. For a moment, I stopped in an attempt to reorient myself in the delusion, but oddly, a very tangible force of energy seemed to propel my body forward once more. As the priest stepped aside, I peered over the dampened dirt mound a few feet ahead and down into the pit. It was completely empty. The fresh smell of wet dirt met my nostrils. Where was the coffin or the body? Puzzled, I turned around with questions mounting, but found that the priest had vanished, as had the other participants in this odd encounter. The house off in the distance was visible, but only barely through what lingered of the fog, and as far as my eyes could travel in the darkness, I couldn't discern a single muddy footprint, not one. Impossible. My mind raced and came up with solutions that seemed increasingly ludicrous in every sense. Just then, and from behind me in the direction of the river, I could hear water rustling about and the sound of an oar cutting through the current. I strained to catch a glimpse of whatever was plodding its way toward the banks, but I couldn't make anything out. I shook my head in disbelief and started for the water's edge. It seemed as coherent an idea as any at the moment, and then I saw him. The old man paddled slower and slower, it seemed, likely in an effort to avoid beaching the small wooden boat that glided through the water with relative ease. Wiry gray and white hair emerged from every part of his lanky body, now fully visible in the unobstructed light of the moon. His clothes appeared foreign, or at least that's the only way I could describe them, having seen little of the land beyond the low country. A long, tall coat stretched neck to toe, and seemed inescapably black. But that's not what terrified me. His eyes seemed to glow with a radiant energy that pierced the night, and for a moment I felt paralyzed in place. As he guided the vessel gently to the water's edge, he at last stole a glance fully in my direction. Up from the trance I awakened, and sauntered down to meet him. His outstretched hand welcomed mine, and I stepped aboard the aging boat, sitting calmly on its floorboards. I searched those radiant eyes for guidance, and asked a question without speaking. He replied in kind, and a calm washed over me, like the sun on a spring day. I pulled a large coin from my pocket, placed it inside my mouth, and nodded in his direction as we shoved off.